Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia SEM-V tutorial series. Today we're going to do the first of our preset deep dives, where I take one of the stock presets. I'm going to be dealing with this Biscott preset today, and pull it to pieces to find out how this synth works. If you're enjoying this series, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below, which is a fantastic way to help support me carry on making these videos. Okay, here's the sound. Actually quite difficult to play because there's kind of a jarring little moment at the beginning of each note. But when you start merging the notes together, it becomes quite otherworldly. Now you might be forgiven for thinking that there's a sequence or an arpeggio in there somewhere, because it's obviously got this bouncing effect, but as we can quite clearly see, there is no arpeggiator. And your second thought might be, well, maybe it's something to do with the 8-voice programmer, maybe it's causing that bouncing effect. I suppose the first thing I should do is take the chorus and delay away, because you might think that it's all coming from the delay. I need to turn it down a little bit, actually, it's just a bit loud without the delay on. But no, still largely the same kind of sound, so it's not there. Let's keep on having a look to find out where this bouncing effect is coming from. Well, here's the 8-voice programmer and none of the modules are on, so sure isn't that. And if we have a look in the keyboard follows section, it's highly unlikely to be anything to do with this, but it definitely isn't, because as you can see, we've only got pan. So where on earth is this bouncing effect coming from? Well, let's just keep turning things off until we find it. I'm going to turn all of the advanced features off in their entirety. So now we're just dealing with the main synth. What have we got so far? Still largely intact. Well, I'll put you out your misery. The effect is actually coming predominantly from the VCF. It's a very serious LFO operating on the frequency modulation. If I take the modulation away entirely, we still get that strange stutter at the beginning of the note, but now it's not pulsing quite so intently. There is still a pulse there, we've pulled some of it away. Let's keep on stripping stuff away until we can get to a sound that we have some sort of hope of deconstructing. The next thing I'm going to throw away is the sub-oscillator. Take that out. We'll bring all of this back in, don't worry. And I'm also going to take out VCO2. So we're now down to a single oscillator. What have we got? Okay, now the oscilloscope is giving you a pretty good idea of what's going on here. That's quite clearly pulse width modulation being applied to VCO1. And sure enough, here's the modulation knob set to pulse width maximum. You can see that the pulse width itself has been set to 90%, and the pulse is coming from LFO1. I'm not sure if I said in the main series LFO1 is just a simple sine wave, so it's undulating backwards and forwards 1.5 times a second. That's what's causing the effect. So finally, if we take this modulation away on the pulse width, we're finally going to get some sort of static sound. There we go. So finally we've thrown enough stuff away to have a starting point that we can start building stuff back up again. There are many different ways to approach preset deconstructions. In this particular case, I've thrown almost everything away and we'll bring it in module by module. Sometimes it's actually better to go the other way and start with the entire sound and take one single thing away at a time and figure out what that does. In this case, we just happen to be building from the ground up. So let's bring the pulse width modulation back in fully and have a look at it in the oscilloscope again. I'm going to slow it down. Now, as I said, that's a sine wave, but it doesn't look like a sine wave because part of the period is occupied with the pulse width at maximum. Modulation doesn't particularly care if it hits a maximum. The modulation itself will carry on into kind of a non-space, and while it's there, while it's modulating something beyond what is already its maximum, you end up with a static value. Let's say you're increasing and decreasing volume, you've got some sort of tremolo effect, and you get up to the maximum volume that a synthesizer can generate. Well, if the modulation takes you past that point and all the way back down again, for that entire period of time, you don't hear anything different. The synthesizer can't generate more than maximum volume. So you just hear a constant volume until the modulation comes back down into some sort of range that has an effect. That's exactly what's happening here. If I pull both the modulation value and the pulse width down, eventually we'll get to a stage where the entire modulation cycle is actually having some noticeable effect on the sound. And there you can see it. So now for 100% of the time we can hear that modulation effect. The moment I increase the modulation past maximum again, we have a period of time when there's no discernible change. And that's what's causing these strange pulsing effects, made even more dramatic by the fact that it's modulating around this 90% or effectively maximum pulse width. So for basically half the time now, you can't go past 90%, that's as much as the synth can do. And so for all of that time, for half of the time that this sine wave is oscillating, you're getting no discernible modulation. A very quick look at VCO1 while we're here. It's tuned 12 semitones down, so this particular component of the sound is producing all of the beefy heft. That's made more dramatic when we bring the sub oscillator back in. Let's do that now. So there's the sub pulse wave with pulse width modulation at 26%. So the combination of those two, VCO1 plus the sub, is really what's giving the depth and grit to the sound. Now I'm deliberately playing quite high up on the keyboard here. I'm playing 2 octaves higher than my normal low C, right down at the bottom. It's massively thuddy. So that's where you're really getting the effect of the sub at 2 octaves below, VCO1 at 1 octave below. Everything has been thrown down into very dark range. So I'm deliberately playing 2 octaves higher to give us something that we can actually listen to a little bit more reasonably. Okay, that's a good start. So that's VCO1 and the sub dealt with, but we've made so many changes to the sound. What I like to do at this point is basically throw the preset away. So we're back to the sound straight out of the box. Once again, I'll throw the effects away without even thinking about them. And I'm also going to turn all of the outboard effects off, because now I want to have a listen to VCO2. That's the one oscillator we've not concentrated on yet. So I'll throw VCO1 away and the sub. See what VCO2 is doing. So again, we get that really quick moment at the beginning when the sound gets pinched, and then we get into the repeating thing. Let's deal with that repeating thing first. It's coming from LFO2, operating on the frequency modulation. So LFO2 is a sawtooth, and if I slow it right down and you watch it in the oscilloscope, you should be able to catch what's happening. Ignore that moment right at the very beginning, we've not got there yet. But there you can see the sawtooth wave modulating the filter frequency. Now watch what happens when I hold that note down and I increase the rate of the LFO. Really cool effect. And it's at this point that I want to go back to the advanced screens to bring one of the features back in. Because if we have a look on the modulation page, the modulation wheel is tied to LFO2 frequency modulation. In other words, the knob that I was just turning manually. So we can get that effect off the modulation wheel. Let's bring that back in. You can also see, while we're here, that there's another modulation connection made between the velocity, how hard you hit the key, and the VCF frequency. So if I hit a really dull note, you get that kind of pinging, that really dull pinging effect. If I play the same note with higher velocity, so there's the VCF frequency being cranked up. But what we really came here to check out is this modulation wheel effect. So I'll turn my mod wheel all the way down. In fact, it's really hard to see, but here's the mod wheel all the way down at the bottom of the interface. And now if I start increasing the modulation wheel, you might just be able to see me turning the mod wheel up. And that's having the same effect as if I'd done that manually from this control. This is the cool thing about deconstructing a preset. Sometimes you don't discover the absolute gems. You need to know to move the modulation wheel to get this amazingly cool sound. When you deconstruct it, you're going to find out all of this stuff. Great though it is, I'm going to turn it back off so that we can get back to concentrating on the raw sound. So VCO2, we've just checked out the LFO is operating on the modulation of the VCF, but I just want to have a look at the oscillator's sound itself. Have a look at the frequency knob for VCO2. It's been tuned up by 4 semitones plus a little bit actually. It's basically a major third above the root. So every time we press a note, if I press a C on the keyboard, you can see an E in the tuner. So if I just temporarily bring VCO1 back in, there's the major third. And you can hear that tuners really like to concentrate on the lowest note, so it's basically registering a C, that's the dominant tone effectively, and then the E over the top is an overtone. So we're getting basically a free chord out of this thing, that's nice. We've also got pulse width modulation set to maximum, but this time it's being fired off envelope 2, and this is one of those missing pieces of the puzzle. That kind of sharp pinching sound that we're getting at the beginning of each tone is being generated by envelope 2. So let's throw the preset away, get back to it completely raw again, turn both effects off, just for kicks, even though there's nothing dramatic going on over here, but I'm going to turn all of the advanced pages off too. So here's what it sounds like from the core engine as it stands. That curious kind of sound at the beginning. Now let's turn this pulse width modulation off on VCO2 that's creating that pinch effect. And now you can hear that higher, this is the overtone sound that we're listening to, comes in much more cleanly. Take the other oscillators away, really focus in on that. We've just got a nice simple oscillator with that VCF being pinged from the LFO, from the sawtooth LFO. So it's a very complex sound this, there's an awful lot going into it. Okay, so we've built the sound up from the perspective of the oscillators. We've now figured out what VCO 1, 2 and the sub are doing. Let's have a whistle stop tour through the rest of the advanced pages. One final time I'm going to turn the chorus and delay off, we'll get there last. We've already seen the modulation, I'm going to turn that off. Let's just have a look at the 8-voice programmer. Now this is one of these things, I call these Easter eggs. All of the effects are turned off, but 2 of them are actually dialed in. The VCO1 pulse width has some settings made to it, and the VCF frequency does as well. If I bring both of those in, I'll just play a chord first. Now I'm going to play exactly the same chord, having brought both of these programmer effects in. The reason I'm playing chords is because both of these effects are operating off re-triggers, which means that every time you press a single key, as we saw in the main tutorial series, it's firing the same voice every time. But when we play a chord, it uses different voices. So for instance, here where we're dealing with VCO1 pulse width, you're going to get different pulse width modulation amounts depending on which note of the chord is being played. 1, second chord, third note. And that's just going to create greater tonal effect. I won't spend any longer than that because it's not actually used in this sound, but I really like, if I find something in the preset that seems intriguing and isn't currently engaged, turn it on, see what it sounds like, it might be cool. Key follow, we've just got pan set, and this is the only one of the effects that is actually programmed. And for the majority of the time when you're playing the useful frequency range of the synthesizer, it's not having that much effect because the majority of the kind of the listenable tones, there's a pretty flat line. But if I turn this on, it is on. If I play a low note, there you can hear that in the left ear, and a high note, that's over on the right hand side. But for the majority of the time, see the little strobing light telling you which notes being played. For the majority of the time it's having a minimal effect. It's throwing the bass over to the left hand side and the really high notes, well, some of them over further onto the right hand side. And finally we get to deal with the effects. Just throw the thing away, come back again. Chorus first. So simple note without the chorus. Bring the chorus in. That stereo spread is really effective. And now let's bring the delay in. And there it is, it's bouncing. So it's an additional bouncing effect on top of the VCF modulation effect, which is the principal means by which the sound's being repeated, but the delay is then stacking on top of it. So a fascinating preset. I think there's tons of good stuff to take away from this. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much for watching.